appealed. In the same year, Britain's first motor car factory was opened in Coventry. The Daimler cars it produced found themselves in a horse-drawn world that had not changed much since the invention of the wheel. Traffic noise in 1896 still meant the endless clatter of steel horseshoes and carriage wheels on cobblestones. Among those whose lives were to be changed forever by the motor car was a little girl of 2.
The noise was awful, but when anybody was really frightfully ill, you were able to go to the London Council, paying a lot of money in those days, and they threw down straw over your bit of road if you lived in a square.
When I was a little boy, I can still remember that my parents had some wealthy friends who had a coach and horses. And as a great treat, I used to be taken for a ride in Richmond Park or somewhere, and I was allowed to sit up by the driver with his reins and his whip and horses. And eventually, those folk were the first customers for motor cars. And that poor coachman, he jolly well got to learn how to drive a motor car.
Oh, what the world is coming to, I really do not know. Folks seem to think that horses are nowadays too slow. For everywhere are motors, with horrid bustling ways, to life and limb a danger, yet they're all the craze. Just think of a nice carriage, drawn by a handsome pair, a coachman, proud and pompous, with condescending air. A footman, both arms folded and supercilious mien. A vehicle more dignified is nowhere to be seen. And then, think of a motor, tearing through the streets, scattering pedestrians and everything it meets.
There were still some old horse-loving squires who loathed all motorists with a die-hard hatred.
So road rage is nothing new. But giving the motorists a good thrashing was a risky business. He had money and almost certainly came from the upper classes, perhaps even the nobility. Safer to keep well out of his way and hope the new motor mania would soon pass. But an influential minority of gentlemen enthusiasts believed that the motor age was here to stay. In 1897, they formed the Automobile Club of Great Britain, soon to become the Royal Automobile Club. They built themselves a palatial headquarters in London's Pall Mall.
You know, I think you're all wrong about motor cars.
What?
Actually, they're putting up factories to make more of them. Why, soon every up-to-date person will own a motor car.
Hey, where's that very modern young man of yours today?
He's coming.
It's a motor. I'll bet it's Reggie.
My first memory of cars goes back a long way. I was a little boy, and I remember a young woman lived in a house next door to us, and she had a boyfriend, and he drove up in a motor car one day. It was a Dion Bouton, and I was about 5, and I went out to look at it, and he was a nice young fellow, because I'm of course proud of his absolutely new invention, and he took the trouble to explain this to me. I was only a little boy, and it was there and then I said, motor cars for me. I'm going to have a motor car directly. I can afford it.
Quite suddenly, my grandfather worked in the city, said he'd like to have a car. I believe it's 1906, that sort of date. And he had the Dion Bouton, a little open car with no lid. And he came down from the city and asked if I, aged whatever I was, 8 or something like that, would like to drive out for a drive. It was a very hot summer evening. I had a little white jacket on, and it was covered with black flies. And I looked down and I found my white coat covered with flies because, of course, no windscreens of any sort. We then drove round Wimbledon Common, and it started to boil. And we all stopped, and some little boys came along, and my uncle, my grandfather said, "Get your cap full and get some water."
The Didier Bouton. Yes, I remember that very well. It was a French car. It was a rather a better class car. You stepped onto the running board and climbed onto it, as opposed to climbing into it.
This was a hobby, a cult, And all hobbies and cults, they've got their own dress. In those days, way back, it was still more so. If you played golf, you had to wear things called +4s, which were huge, great trousers that came down and then turned up and did up round here. Motorists had to have special, they were not saloons, they're open cars, and they had special hats.
The driver very often wore a leather outfit and a leather cap and goggles, all of which helped to make him look very much as though he was going to the moon rather than driving a motor car.
And the ladies had very smart scarves which were tied round and so on. Gloves made of leather with gauntlets. I suppose that was left from the days of horse riding, maybe, I don't know. But there was you could always tell a motorist if he was walking along the street, you knew he was a motorist. He got his uniform.
It had to be cranked by hand, of course, as all cars did in those days. There was no self-starter. And cranking the engine was in itself sometimes a dangerous pursuit.
And you wound it, and you let this go, and it was a hard pull like that. And if it didn't fire, throw it round backwards and break your wrist if you weren't really careful. I went out and just sort of gazed in adoration of this wonderful new invention, completely new idea.
All brass. Everything, the radiator cover, the lamps, the headlamps, the side lamps, all brass, all had to be clean. The headlamps in those days, of course, were not electric.
And they're oil lamps, and they're chiefly made by Lucas, and every one of them said King of the Road on them. Really beautiful. And some of them have got bullseye lens, you know, to intensify the light.
You went for lovely drives, miles on, perhaps 50 miles round here. Come back, we've had a drive. But I don't think people a drive so much now, do they? I went up to Yorkshire to my uncle and aunt. Now she was the earliest motorist in Yorkshire and took us all over the place to Saltburn. And one day we went as far as Edinburgh, and she had an awful row with the little boys with the road one day. They started to throw stones at us, which of course would have hurt us most frightfully. And I was very impressed with my aunt alone in the car with children. We had 3 first cousins sitting at the back, and one in front, which probably was me, dressing them down at the side of the road, telling them how dangerous it was.
This motoring certainly startled English country life out of its usual calm. The roads were rich in dust, and passing cars churned it up over all and sundry. And all and sundry naturally cursed both driver and machine.
We all had to wear chiffon scarves right over your face. It was absolutely clouds of white chalk, dust.
The dust was shocking. And some people that had got motor cars used to love to go down quickly and dust everybody out with it. The place would be white. The hedges would be white with dust in those days.
Punctures were quite frequent really in those days. We never get punctures nowadays, do we? But we did then.
But the owner, of course, never touched the car himself. It was beneath him, so he brought the underling down to do the work. All he did was sit there and wait until he had something to be done.
Oh, we loved punctures, the children. We were only children. You see, if you had a puncture, you were frightfully late. You see, you got in at 9 o'clock at night one night, because we had a puncture having gone to somewhere out there, like Windsor or somewhere. That was great fun. And naughty little children sitting at the back.
As cars improved, speed became a burning issue. The limit of 20 miles per hour was strictly enforced by the police, who laid speed traps for the pioneer motorists. They responded by forming their own secret society aimed at outwitting Mr. Plod. The word car had not been heard. These machines were motors, or automobiles, so they called their group the Automobile Association. In 1935, the AA celebrated its 30th birthday with this film.
Trapping was killing this motoring in its infancy, but the newly formed AA, with less than £100 in the bank, determined to fight.
Trap lower down, sir. Go easy.
I say, thanks awfully. But who are you?
Automobile Association, sir. By the time we've done with them, the police will have to go back hunting for burglars again.
Jolly good. Many thanks.
Oh, that's all right, sir. The AA pays me.
Automobilism triumphant. Police outwitted by crafty motorists. The belief that motoring laws are there to be broken was firmly established in those early years. The growing influence of the AA was confirmed when the army sought its help.
And they wanted to see how quickly they could take a battalion of grenadiers down to the coast by car instead of carriages.
On March the 17th, 1909, a battalion of His Majesty's Guards was conveyed from London to Hastings in cars owned by our members. Think of it, 1,050 officers and men, and the AA was only 4 years old.
I was in the crowd, seeing them arrive, all the soldiers getting out of cars. It was frightfully exciting.
Soon, the AA became almost as respectable as the rival RAC, with badges and uniformed patrols who would salute members, but only when the coast was clear.
If I stopped you to warn you of a trap ahead of us, we'd be breaking the law. But if I don't warn you, and you stop of your own accord, then we are within the law.
Oh, I get you. A salute means everything's all right, and a non-salute means danger ahead. That's it, sir, in a nutshell.
By 1911, the British car industry was 15 years old. Cars were now seen as a viable means of getting about. Driving was no longer just a joyride. The aristocracy no longer had the roads to themselves. The better-off members of the middle classes, the doctor, the bank manager, and the gentleman farmer began to own and drive cars. But they were still built by hand and cost a small fortune to buy. £250 for a modest family car, £1,000 for a thoroughbred. These craftsmen, employed by Vincents of Reading, would be lucky to earn £2 per week and could never afford to buy the cars they built. But things were about to change. In Manchester, the American Ford Company began mass production of the first people's car.
Here we are, the Model T Ford, the Tin Lizzie as it was affectionately known. Henry Ford designed this car. He made a very good job of it, really, because it brought motoring to Mr. and Mrs. Everybody.
And in 1911, it cost only £150 to buy. By the end of the First World War, the Model T was a familiar sight on Britain's roads. Mass motoring had arrived.
Dad was the first private grocer in Liverpool to own a car. And of course a Model T Ford then was the car to own. And the result was, when he ever went anywhere, people would say, oh, here's Billy Atchison in his Model T coming along, you know. Anyway, after that, when we got as far as a Wednesday evening, because Dad was Wednesday afternoon closing day then, and he'd come and meet us from school, and the kids would look through the window or the railings of the school and say, oh, look at they got a car. They couldn't believe it. All us children just wanted to get out into the country and see places. It was an event, and we loved going out. And of course then the roads were pretty rough in those days. They weren't like they are now.
Spare parts, it was absolutely a case of cannibalising other vehicles. Just remember, the Model T was first built in 1909 in America, so there was enough of them about for people to bust up, and we could go to the scrapyard and get the pieces. And that was the only way you could keep going. Henry Ford said it had to be very, very simple. When I first drove one of these. I was just 12 years old. And it would go literally anywhere except into society. And that is the Model T Ford.